The thunder cracked like a whip across the Montana sky as Grace Edwards clutched her thin shawl tighter around her shoulders, staring at the weathered sign that welcomed her to Redemption Creek. A town of less than 500 souls, nestled between rolling hills and endless prairie, it represented her last chance at a new beginning, far from the memories of Boston and the family who had disowned her. The year was 1879. And at 22, Grace had already experienced more heartache than most would in a lifetime. Her parents' deaths from influenza had left her at the mercy of relatives who viewed her as nothing more than an unwelcome burden. When they arranged a marriage to a man 3 times her age, she fled west with nothing but a carpetbag of possessions and the teaching certificate she'd earned at normal school. Mud sucked at her boots as she made her way down the main street. Redemption Creek was like countless other frontier towns, a collection of wooden buildings with false fronts, a church steeple rising above the rest, horses tied to hitching posts, while men in dusty clothes moved with purpose between the general store, saloon, and livery. "Miss, you look like you might be needing some help." The voice belonged to a kindly-looking woman with gray streaks in her dark hair, standing beneath the awning of a millinery shop. "I'm looking for Sheriff Miller," Grace replied, her Boston accent marking her immediately as an outsider. "I've been hired as the town's new schoolteacher." The woman's face brightened. "Well, bless my soul. We've been waiting on you for nearly a month. I'm Martha Wilson. I run the boarding house where you'll be staying." Before Grace could respond, the sound of breaking glass and angry shouts erupted from the saloon. Martha's expression darkened as the batwing doors burst open and a man was thrown bodily into the street, landing hard in the mud. "And stay out, Caine!" roared a voice from inside. The man in the mud slowly rose to his feet. He was tall and lean, with broad shoulders and sun-darkened skin. His eyes, startlingly blue against his weathered face, held a coldness that sent a shiver down Grace's spine. A thin scar ran from his temple to his jaw, and several days' worth of stubble covered his face. "Xavier Caine," Martha whispered, her tone a mixture of pity and disapproval. "Best you stay clear of him, miss. That man's got more demons than the devil's got sinners." Xavier Caine straightened his hat, which had somehow remained on his head despite his rough ejection from the saloon. He didn't bother dusting off the mud that clung to his clothes. Instead, he reached inside his jacket and pulled out a silver flask. After taking a long swig, he finally seemed to notice Grace's stare. For a moment, their eyes locked. Grace felt something electric pass between them, not attraction exactly, but recognition of some kind. Then his lip curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Welcome to Redemption Creek," he said, his voice a low, rough rasp. "Ain't nothing but liars and thieves here, madam. Best turn around and head back east while you still can." With that, he turned and walked away, his spurs jingling with each step, leaving Grace to wonder what kind of place she had come to. The schoolhouse was a simple one-room building at the edge of town, with rows of wooden desks facing a larger teacher's desk and blackboard. The attached living quarters were Spartan but clean. A narrow bed, a small stove, a table with 2 chairs, and a bookshelf with a few tattered volumes. Sheriff Miller, a man with kind eyes and a graying mustache, had shown her around before handing over the key. "Town council's mighty pleased to have an educated lady like yourself taking over the school," he said. "Our last teacher, Mr. Patterson, left rather sudden-like after some trouble with the Blackwater gang." Grace's stomach tightened. "Trouble?" The sheriff must have noted her concern because he quickly added, "Nothing for you to worry about, Miss Edwards. We ran those outlaws off months ago. This is a good town with good people." Except for Xavier Caine, Grace thought, remembering the harsh cowboy's warning. "I should mention," Sheriff Miller continued, looking somewhat uncomfortable, "that Xavier Caine's ranch, the Broken Spur, borders school property to the north. He doesn't come into town much, and when he does, it's usually just for supplies or—" He cleared his throat. "Well, he keeps to himself mostly." "I met Mr. Caine earlier," Grace said. "He seemed troubled." The sheriff's expression grew solemn. War changes a man, Miss Edwards. Caine fought for the Union. Came back different, they say. Used to be the friendliest young man in the county. Now He shook his head. Just give him a wide berth. He won't bother you none if you don't bother him. Grace soon settled into a routine. She taught 27 children ranging in age from 6 to 16, from the banker's son to the blacksmith's daughters to the ranch hand's children who rode miles on horseback each day to attend. The work was challenging, but rewarding, and the townspeople were welcoming all except for Xavier Caine, who she occasionally glimpsed riding the perimeter of his property on a massive black stallion. She learned more about him through town gossip. He'd inherited the broken spur from his uncle 5 years earlier and had turned it into one of the most successful cattle operations in the territory, despite working with minimal help. People spoke of his skill with horses, his deadly accuracy with a gun, and his tendency to drink himself into oblivion when the nightmares got too bad. He wasn't always like this, elderly Mrs. Hawkins told Grace one Sunday after church. Before the war, Xavier was the sweetest boy you ever did meet, could charm the birds right out of the trees. His mama died birthing him, and his pa was killed by Indians when he was just 12. His uncle raised him up right, though. Then the war came, and he joined up at 17. Whatever happened to him during those years? She shook her head sadly. Some wounds don't leave scars you can see. Grace found herself watching for him whenever she ventured outside the schoolhouse. There was something about Xavier Caine that called to her, perhaps because she recognized in him the same kind of pain she carried herself. Their first real encounter came on a crisp October morning. Grace had taken her students outside for a natural science lesson, having them collect leaves and identify the trees they came from. They were scattered across the schoolyard when the thunder of hooves approached. Xavier Caine rode up on his black stallion, reining in hard when he spotted the children, his eyes as cold as ever fixed on Grace. "Your students are trespassing on my land," he said without preamble. Grace straightened her spine. "We're on school property, Mr. Caine." He dismounted in one fluid motion, moving with a grace that belied his size. "That fence marks the boundary." He pointed to a weathered post about 20 yards beyond, where several children were gathering leaves. "Everything beyond it belongs to the broken spur." "I wasn't aware," Grace said, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize for the confusion." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her immediate apology. "Children," she called, "please come back this way. We need to respect Mr. Caine's property." The children scurried back, some looking curiously at Xavier, others avoiding his gaze entirely. One small boy, Charlie Wilson, Martha's youngest grandson, tripped in his haste and began to cry when he scraped his knee. Before Grace could reach him, Xavier was there. He knelt beside the boy, his movements surprisingly gentle. "You're all right, son," he said, his voice softer than Grace had ever heard it. "Just a scratch. Here, let me see." He produced a clean handkerchief from his pocket and carefully dabbed at the small amount of blood on the boy's knee. "I've seen men take bullets without making half the fuss," he said, but there was no malice in his tone. "You're tougher than you think." Charlie's tears stopped as he stared up at the intimidating cowboy. "Really?" Xavier nodded solemnly. "Really?" He helped the boy to his feet and gave him a gentle push toward Grace. "Back to your teacher now." Grace was stunned by this glimpse of tenderness from a man the town considered little more than a dangerous recluse. "Thank you, Mr. Caine." He met her gaze, and for a moment the coldness in his eyes thawed. Then, as if catching himself, he nodded curtly, remounted his horse, and rode away without another word. That night, Grace found herself unable to sleep, thinking about the contradictions of Xavier Caine, the harsh, bitter exterior, and the unexpected gentleness with young Charlie. She wondered what experiences had shaped him, what sorrows he carried that made him keep everyone at arm's length. Winter came early that year, with a November blizzard that howled down from the mountains and buried Redemption Creek under 3 feet of snow. Grace awoke one morning to find her small woodpile nearly depleted, and the path to the woodshed completely blocked by drifts. She was contemplating attempting to dig her way through when a knock came at her door. Opening it, she found Xavier Caine on her doorstep, his shoulders dusted with snow, his arms full of firewood. "Mr. Caine," she said, surprised. "Miss Edwards." He shifted uncomfortably. "Thought you might be running low. Storm's going to get worse before it gets better." "Thank you." She stepped aside to let him enter. "Please, come in." He hesitated for a moment before stepping inside, ducking his head to clear the door frame. He moved to the wood box near the stove and carefully stacked the logs. "I can bring more," he said, straightening. "Got plenty at my place." "That's very kind of you," Grace replied, noticing how he seemed to fill the small space of her quarters, making it feel suddenly cramped. "Would you like some coffee? It's the least I can offer for your trouble." Again that hesitation, as if he was unused to simple kindness. Finally, he nodded. "That would be. Thank you." Grace busied herself preparing the coffee, acutely aware of Xavier standing awkwardly by the stove, his hat in his hands, revealing dark hair that curled slightly at the nape of his neck. "I noticed you've been teaching the children about the stars," he said, gesturing to the chart of constellations Grace had drawn on the blackboard. "Yes," she said, surprised he'd noticed. "Do you have an interest in astronomy, Mr. Caine?" A shadow of something like pain crossed his face. "My uncle taught me the stars, said a man could never truly be lost if he could read the night sky." Grace handed him a steaming cup. "Your uncle sounds like a wise man." He was. Xavier took a careful sip of the coffee. "This is good. Better than the tar I brew." "Teaching 27 children requires strong coffee," Grace said with a smile. The corner of Xavier's mouth twitched in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I imagine it does." They fell into an awkward silence, broken only by the howl of the wind outside and the occasional pop from the stove. Grace found herself studying him when he wasn't looking, the strong line of his jaw, the way his hands, rough from hard work, cradled the delicate china cup, the distant look in his eyes, as if part of him was somewhere else entirely. "People talk about you," she said suddenly, immediately regretting the words. His eyes flicked to hers, hardening again. "I'm sure they do." "I didn't mean—" Grace flushed. "I'm sorry, that was rude of me." Xavier set down his cup. "No need to apologize for speaking the truth, Miss Edwards. This town's got nothing better to do than gossip about the crazy war veteran who lives on the edge of town." "That's not what they say," Grace protested. "No?" His voice took on a bitter edge. "What do they say then? That I'm dangerous, unstable? That decent folks should keep their distance?" Grace met his challenging gaze. "They say you weren't always like this, that before the war, you were different." Something flickered in his eyes, pain, vulnerability, quickly masked. "War changes a man," he said, echoing Sheriff Miller's words. "Shows him what he's really capable of." "For better or worse," Grace said softly. Xavier looked at her sharply, as if seeing her properly for the first time. "You're not what I expected, Miss Edwards." "What did you expect?" "Some prissy Eastern girl who'd run screaming at the first sign of trouble." He paused. "But there's steel in you." Grace smiled slightly. "I've had my share of troubles, Mr. Caine. I didn't come west on a whim." He studied her for a long moment, then nodded, as if coming to a decision. "I'll bring more wood tomorrow. And I'll clear a path to your woodshed." "Thank you," Grace said, surprised by the offer. "But you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," he interrupted, putting on his hat. "But I'm going to anyway." True to his word, Xavier returned the next day with more firewood and spent an hour clearing the path to Grace's woodshed. He declined her invitation to stay for lunch, but accepted another cup of coffee before leaving. Over the next few weeks, as winter tightened its grip on Redemption Creek, Xavier became a regular visitor at the schoolhouse. He never stayed long, and their conversations remained largely superficial, but Grace sensed a gradual thawing in his demeanor. The townspeople noticed. Grace overheard whispers in the general store, saw the raised eyebrows when Xavier tipped his hat to her on the rare occasions they encountered each other in town. Martha Wilson was the only one brave enough to mention it directly. Be careful with that one, she warned Grace over tea one Sunday afternoon. Xavier Caine's not the marrying kind. Whatever he's looking for in your company, it ain't a wife. We're merely acquaintances, Grace protested, feeling her cheeks warm. He's been kind enough to help me with a few things around the schoolhouse, that's all. Martha's skeptical expression made it clear she didn't believe a word of it. Just mind your reputation, dear. A schoolteacher must be above reproach. Grace wanted to argue that there was nothing improper about their interactions, but she knew Martha was right to be concerned. In a small town like Redemption Creek, perception often mattered more than reality. Still, she couldn't bring herself to rebuff Xavier's tentative overtures of friendship. There was something about him that called to her, perhaps, because she recognized in him a fellow wounded soul. As the winter days grew shorter, Grace found herself looking forward to his visits more than she cared to admit. She began to notice small changes in him, how his posture relaxed slightly in her presence, how occasionally a genuine smile would briefly transform his features, how his eyes had begun to lose some of their coldness when he looked at her. One evening in early January, as Grace was grading papers by lamplight, a fierce knocking at her door startled her. She opened it to find Xavier standing there, his expression urgent. "Pack whatever you need for the night," he said without preamble. "There's a wolf pack moving through the area. They've already killed livestock at the Peterson place, and they're heading this way." "Wolves," Grace repeated, fear coiling in her stomach. "They're desperate with the hard winter," Xavier explained, already moving to stoke her dying fire. "The schoolhouse isn't secure enough. You'll stay at my ranch tonight." Under normal circumstances, Grace would have protested at such an improper suggestion, but the fear in Xavier's voice convinced her this was no time for propriety. "Give me 5 minutes," she said, already moving to gather her things. The ride to the broken spur was tense and cold, with Xavier constantly scanning their surroundings, one hand resting on the rifle in his saddle holster. Grace rode behind him on his stallion, her arms wrapped around his waist, her face pressed against his back to shield it from the biting wind. The ranch house was larger than Grace had imagined, a solid 2-story structure built of logs and stone, with a wide porch and multiple chimneys. Inside, it was surprisingly comfortable, with sturdy furniture, well-worn rugs, and bookshelves lining one wall of the main room. "You have quite a library," Grace remarked, running her fingers along the spines of books ranging from practical manuals on animal husbandry to volumes of poetry and philosophy. "My uncle believed in education," Xavier said, taking her coat, "even for a ranch hand's nephew." He showed her to a bedroom upstairs. "This was my aunt's sewing room. The bed's not much, but it's clean." "Thank you," Grace said, touched by his concern for her safety. "I appreciate you thinking of me." Xavier paused in the doorway. "I'll check the perimeter once more before turning in. There's a lock on the door, if you'd feel more comfortable using it." The fact that he acknowledged her potential discomfort at staying in a single man's home only increased her trust in him. "I'm sure that won't be necessary," she said with a small smile. Later, as they sat before the fire drinking hot cider, Grace found the courage to ask the question that had been on her mind for months. "What happened to you during the war, Xavier?" He stiffened, his hands tightening around his mug. For a long moment, Grace thought he wouldn't answer. Then, without looking at her, he began to speak. "I was at Shiloh and Antietam, and a dozen other battles whose names I've tried to forget." His voice was flat, emotionless. "But it was Gettysburg that broke me. 3 days of hell on earth. I was part of a sharpshooter unit. He swallowed hard. "We were good at what we did." Grace remained silent, letting him continue at his own pace. "There was this Confederate officer. Young fellow, couldn't have been more than 20. I had him in my sights. Was about to squeeze the trigger when he turned and looked right at me. It was like he knew. In that moment, I saw everything: his fear, his courage, his humanity." Xavier's voice grew hoarse. "I killed him anyway, watched him fall, and something in me died with him." Grace reached out hesitantly and placed her hand over his. War asks terrible things of men. Xavier looked down at their hands, then slowly turned his palm up to clasp hers. After that, I couldn't sleep without seeing their faces. All of them. When my enlistment ended, I couldn't go back to who I was before. Couldn't bear to be around people, to pretend I was still the same Xavier Caine who left Redemption Creek full of ideals about preserving the Union. "So you came back here and isolated yourself," Grace said softly. He nodded. My uncle understood. He'd fought in the Mexican War, had his own demons. When he died, he left me the ranch, and I've poured everything into it. It's easier with animals. They don't expect you to smile or make conversation. Is that why you avoid town? The expectations? Xavier looked into the fire. Partly, and partly because I see the way they look at me, like they're waiting for me to snap, to confirm their worst fears about what the war did to me. I don't look at you that way, Grace said quietly. He finally met her gaze. His eyes vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. No, he agreed. You don't. That's why I keep coming back to your schoolhouse, even though I tell myself to stay away. Grace's heart quickened at the admission. I'm glad you don't stay away. Something shifted between them in that moment, a recognition of feelings neither had been ready to acknowledge before. Xavier's gaze dropped to her lips, and for a breathless moment, Grace thought he might kiss her. Instead, he gently released her hand and stood. It's late, he said, his voice rough. You should get some rest. The howling of wolves in the distance punctuated his words, a reminder of why they were there. Grace nodded and rose as well, suddenly aware of how improper their situation would appear to others. Good night, Xavier, she said, using his first name for the first time. Thank you for keeping me safe. He inclined his head, his expression unreadable once more. Good night, Grace. Grace lay awake for hours that night, listening to the wolves and thinking about the wounded man sleeping down the hall, a man who had shown her glimpses of who he once was and who he might be again. By morning, the wolf pack had moved on, and Xavier escorted Grace back to the schoolhouse. Neither mentioned their conversation from the night before, but something had changed between them. A barrier had fallen. Over the next few weeks, Xavier began helping around the schoolhouse more regularly, fixing a leaky roof, repairing broken desks, even splitting and stacking firewood for her. The children, initially wary of the intimidating cowboy, gradually warmed to him, especially when he started bringing his gentle old cattle dog, Scout, who patiently allowed the younger ones to pet and fuss over him. Grace watched in wonder as Xavier slowly emerged from his shell. He still had his dark moods and sometimes disappeared for days when the memories became too much, but he always returned, a little more of his true self visible each time. The townspeople noticed the change in Xavier, and they noticed his growing attachment to their schoolteacher. Gossip spread like wildfire. He's sweet on her, Grace overheard Mrs. Peterson tell another woman at the general store. Never thought I'd see the day Xavier Caine showed interest in anything besides his cattle and his whiskey. She could do better, the other woman replied. That man's damaged goods if ever I saw them. No decent woman would tie herself to someone like him. Grace had walked away, anger burning in her chest at their callous words. If only they could see what she saw, the gentle way Xavier treated children and animals, his quiet intelligence, the honor that guided his actions even when no one was watching. Spring arrived, melting the snow and bringing new life to the valley. With the warmer weather, Xavier invited Grace to go riding with him one Sunday afternoon. He took her to a hidden meadow filled with wildflowers, high above the town. My mother loved wildflowers, he told her as they sat on a fallen log, watching the wind create waves in the tall grass. My uncle used to bring me here and tell me stories about her, said she was the kindest woman he ever knew. You have her kindness in you, Grace said. I see it when you're with the children. Xavier looked surprised. Most people would say I'm anything but kind. Most people don't really know you, she replied simply. He studied her face for a long moment. And you do? Grace met his gaze steadily. I'm beginning to. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Xavier reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. His fingers lingered against her cheek. "Grace," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I'm not a whole man. I may never be again. Whatever you think you see in me, I don't want you to be disappointed when you realize it isn't real. I see a man who carries deep wounds, but hasn't let them destroy his capacity for gentleness," Grace said, covering his hand with hers. "I see someone who thinks he's broken beyond repair, but who keeps trying anyway. That's real, Xavier. That's who you are." He closed his eyes, his expression pained. "I don't deserve your faith in me." "It's not about deserving," Grace said. "It's about seeing you clearly." When Xavier opened his eyes again, they were filled with a vulnerability that took her breath away. Slowly, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. Their courtship progressed slowly after that. Xavier was cautious, almost reverent in his attention to Grace, as if he couldn't quite believe she returned his feelings. For her part, Grace found herself falling deeper in love with him with each passing day, discovering new facets of his character as he gradually allowed her to see past his defenses. The town's reaction was predictably negative. When word spread that Xavier Caine was courting the schoolteacher, concerned parents began to question whether Grace was a suitable influence on their children. Sheriff Miller reluctantly conveyed the school board's concerns to her. "They're not questioning your teaching abilities, Miss Edwards," he explained awkwardly. "It's just that your association with Caine has raised some eyebrows." "My personal life is my own affair," Grace replied stiffly. The sheriff sighed. "In a town this size, nothing is truly private. I'm just asking you to be discreet." But Grace was tired of discretion, tired of the town's judgment of a man they refused to understand. The next Sunday, she walked proudly beside Xavier into church, taking a seat next to him in the back pew, ignoring the shocked glances and whispered comments. Xavier, for his part, sat rigid beside her, his face an expressionless mask that didn't betray the anxiety she knew he must be feeling. After the service, when people gave them a wide berth as they exited, he turned to her with troubled eyes. "You shouldn't have done that," he said quietly. "They'll turn against you because of me." "Let them," Grace replied, taking his arm firmly. "I'm not ashamed of you, Xavier Caine, and I refuse to act as if I should be." His expression softened. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Grace Edwards." 2 months later, Xavier asked Grace to marry him. They were sitting on her small porch after school, watching the sunset paint the distant mountains gold and crimson. "I can't offer you much," he said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "The ranch is successful enough, but I still have nightmares. Still have days when I can barely stand to be in my own skin. You deserve better than a half a man." Grace took his face in her hands, forcing him to look at her. "You are not half a man, Xavier Caine. You are the man I love, scars and all. And yes, I will marry you." The news of their engagement was met with disbelief and disapproval throughout Redemption Creek. When Grace entered the general store, the day after they announced their intentions, conversation stopped abruptly. Mrs. Peterson and her friends exchanged looks of pity and judgment. "Throwing your life away on that man," Martha Wilson said bluntly when Grace visited the boarding house to tell her personally. "I thought you had better sense, child." "I love him," Grace said simply. "Love?" Martha scoffed. "What about stability, security? How can you build a life with someone who might fly into a rage at any moment? Who drinks to forget whatever horrors he saw in that war?" "Xavier hasn't touched a drop of whiskey in 3 months," Grace replied quietly. "And he's never, ever directed his anger toward me or anyone else. He turns it inward, Martha. That's what hurts him the most." The older woman's expression softened slightly. "I just don't want to see you hurt, dear. Life with a man like Xavier Caine won't be easy." "The best things rarely are," Grace said. Despite the town's disapproval, Grace and Xavier were married on a perfect June day in 1880 in a small ceremony performed by the circuit preacher. Only Sheriff Miller and his wife attended as witnesses, along with a few of Grace's students who defied their parents' prohibitions. The town's reaction was exactly as Grace had expected, barely concealed mockery and prediction of disaster. She held her head high and ignored the whispers, the pointed silences when she entered a room, the way some parents withdrew their children from her classroom. Life at the Broken Spur was an adjustment. Grace continued teaching while learning the rhythms of ranch life. Xavier hired 2 more hands to help with the cattle, allowing him more time to repair and improve the house. Together, they turned it into a true home, adding curtains to the windows, filling the bookshelves with Grace's favorite novels, alongside Xavier's practical manuals, planting a vegetable garden and flower beds. Xavier still had his dark days times when the memories overwhelmed him, and he would retreat into himself, sometimes disappearing for hours on horseback. But he always returned, and he always found his way back to Grace. And slowly, those days became less frequent. What surprised them both was how their marriage gradually changed the town's perception. It started with the children, who adored Mr. Caine and his stories about cattle drives and the proper way to ride a horse. They brought those stories home, along with accounts of how he had fixed the schoolhouse roof or built new bookshelves for their classroom. Then came the spring roundup, when Xavier organized the local ranchers to work together, bringing in their scattered cattle. His knowledge and leadership earned grudging respect from men who had previously avoided him. When drought threatened the summer hay crop, it was Xavier who devised a water-sharing system that saved many of the smaller farms. And when a traveling medicine show's campfire got out of control, threatening the eastern edge of town, Xavier led the bucket brigade that fought the flames through the night. Slowly, perception shifted. The harsh, damaged war veteran became the capable rancher, the dedicated husband, the unexpected community leader. Not everyone changed their minds. Some of the old-timers still viewed him with suspicion, but enough did that Grace and Xavier found themselves increasingly included in town gatherings and social events. Their first Christmas as a married couple, they hosted a party for Grace's students at the ranch. Xavier had secretly worked with the ranch hands to build a small sleigh, which he hitched to his gentlest draft horses to give the children rides across the snowy fields. Watching him lift the smallest children into the sleigh, his face alight with genuine pleasure at their excitement, Grace felt her heart might burst with love for this man who had fought so hard to reclaim his humanity. Later that night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Xavier traced the curve of her cheek with gentle fingers. "I never thought I'd have this," he confessed. "After the war, I was convinced I didn't deserve happiness, that I was too broken, too damaged to ever be whole again." Grace caught his hand and pressed a kiss to his palm. "You've always been whole, Xavier. You just couldn't see it yourself." In the spring of 1881, Grace discovered she was expecting their first child. Xavier's reaction was a mixture of joy and terror. Joy at the prospect of fatherhood, terror at the responsibility. "What if I'm not good at this?" he asked Grace one night, his hand resting gently on her still flat stomach. "What if the darkness in me somehow touches our child?" "There is no darkness in you that could ever harm our child," Grace assured him. "You're going to be a wonderful father, Xavier. I've seen you with my students. You have so much love to give." As Grace's pregnancy progressed, Xavier became increasingly protective. He insisted on driving her to and from the schoolhouse each day, much to the amusement of the townspeople. He read every book on childbirth and infant care he could find, peppering the town's doctor with questions until the poor man began to avoid him. The town's attitude toward their marriage had evolved from mockery to grudging acceptance to, in some cases, genuine support. When several of the local women organized a baby shower for Grace at the church hall, she was moved to tears by their kindness and by the sight of Martha Wilson presenting Xavier with a hand-knitted baby blanket. "My Henry had his demons too, after the Mexican War," the older woman told him quietly. But he was a good husband and a fine father. You will be too. The autumn of 1881 brought new threats to Redemption Creek. Reports of the notorious Blackwater gang's return to the territory put the entire county on edge. This vicious group of outlaws, led by the ruthless Jeremiah Blackwater, had terrorized the region for years before seemingly disappearing after a confrontation with Army troops. Sheriff Miller called a town meeting to warn residents to be vigilant. "They've hit 3 banks in neighboring counties," he explained grimly. "Intelligence suggests they might be heading this way next." Xavier, now respected enough to have a voice in town affairs, suggested organizing a volunteer patrol to supplement the sheriff's limited manpower. He took the first night shift himself, riding the perimeter of town with his rifle across his saddle. Grace worried constantly during this time, especially as her pregnancy advanced. She was 7 months along, her belly now prominently rounded, when the Blackwater gang finally struck not at the bank as expected, but at the school. It happened on a crisp November afternoon. Grace had dismissed her students early due to her increasing fatigue, and was alone in the schoolhouse grading papers when the door burst open. 3 men entered, their faces partially concealed by bandanas, guns drawn. "Well, well," said the tallest of the 3, his eyes cold above his mask. "If it ain't the schoolmarm, you must be Caine's woman." Grace's heart hammered in her chest as she instinctively placed a protective hand over her unborn child. "What do you want?" "Your husband's been causing us problems," the man said, approaching her desk slowly. "Organizing those patrols, making it difficult for us to do business in this territory. Jeremiah figures taking you might convince him to back off." Fear made Grace's mouth go dry, but she forced herself to remain calm. "My husband isn't a man you want to cross," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The outlaw laughed. "That right? The way I hear it, he's nothing but a broken-down war veteran who got lucky enough to catch himself an Eastern lady." "Then you've heard wrong," Grace replied, her eyes darting to the window. If she could just create a distraction. But the outlaws were too quick. Before she could move, 2 of them had seized her arms, pulling her roughly to her feet. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, madam," the leader said. "We just need you as insurance. You behave, and you'll be back with your husband in a few days, no worse for wear." "I'm 7 months pregnant," Grace said, hoping to appeal to whatever humanity these men might possess. "Please, don't do this." For a moment she thought she saw hesitation in the leader's eyes. Then he hardened. "All the more reason for Caine to do as he's told when we send our demands." They were leading her toward the door when a shot rang out. The window shattered, and the outlaw holding Grace's right arm dropped with a cry of pain, clutching his shoulder. "Let her go." Xavier's voice, cold and deadly calm, came from outside. "Next shot won't be a warning." The remaining outlaws shoved Grace to the floor and opened fire toward the window. Grace crawled behind her desk as bullets splintered the wood around her. She heard more gunshots from outside, then a terrible silence. The schoolhouse door burst open again, and Grace prepared for the worst. But it was Xavier who appeared, his face a mask of controlled fury, his gun still drawn. "Grace!" His eyes scanned the room frantically until he spotted her behind the desk. The relief on his face was palpable as he rushed to her side, holstering his weapon to help her up. "Are you hurt? The baby?" "We're fine," she assured him, trembling with delayed shock. "How did you know?" "One of the students saw suspicious men heading toward the school and ran to find me," Xavier explained, his arms tight around her. "Thank God I was in town." Only then did Grace notice the blood seeping through Xavier's shirt at his shoulder. "You're hit." He glanced down dismissively. "Just a graze. Sheriff's rounding up a posse to go after the rest of the gang. I need to get you home where it's safe." Despite Grace's protests, Xavier insisted on taking her directly to the ranch, where he posted 2 of his most trusted hands as guards before riding out to join the posse. He returned late that night. Exhausted but victorious, the Blackwater gang had been captured trying to flee the county. The incident transformed the town's perception of Xavier completely. What they had previously seen as dangerous intensity they now recognized as protective strength. The man they had once mocked for his battle scars was now hailed as a hero who had saved not only his wife, but potentially the entire town from the depredations of the Blackwater gang. At Sunday services, people who had once crossed the street to avoid Xavier now approached to shake his hand. The women who had pitied Grace for her choice of husband now envied her. Even Martha Wilson admitted she had been wrong about him. "A man who risks his life for his family is a man worth having," she told Grace. "Your Xavier has proven himself beyond any doubt." The change in the town's attitude was gratifying, but Xavier himself seemed unchanged by their newfound respect. "I didn't do it for them," he told Grace that night as they sat before the fire, his hand resting on her rounded belly. "I did it for you. For our child. You're the only opinions that matter to me." Their daughter, Emma, was born on a snowy January morning in 1882. Xavier paced anxiously outside the bedroom while the doctor and Martha Wilson attended Grace through a difficult but ultimately successful delivery. When Martha finally invited him in, Xavier approached the bed with such reverence that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. "She's beautiful," he whispered, gently touching the downy black hair that covered their daughter's tiny head. "She looks like you." "She has your eyes," Grace replied, seeing the unmistakable blue that marked Xavier's most striking feature. Watching him cradle their daughter for the first time, his large hands impossibly gentle as he supported her delicate head, Grace knew with absolute certainty that all the struggles had been worth it. The man the town had once considered dangerous and unpredictable was the most tender father a child could ask for. Spring brought new beginnings. Xavier expanded the ranch operations, hiring more hands and purchasing additional grazing land. Grace, recovered from childbirth, returned to teaching part-time, bringing Emma with her in a cradle Xavier had crafted himself. The schoolhouse, once simply Grace's workplace, had become a symbol of their life together, the place where they had first formed a connection, where Xavier had slowly revealed his true self to her, where he had saved her and their unborn child from harm. It seemed fitting that it should now witness their daughter's first months of life. One warm May afternoon, as Grace sat on a blanket under the schoolyard's only tree, watching Emma sleep while her students enjoyed their lunch break, Xavier rode up on his black stallion. The children greeted him enthusiastically, used to his occasional visits. "What brings you here in the middle of the day?" Grace asked as he dismounted and joined her on the blanket, bending to kiss her before gently touching their sleeping daughter's cheek. "Can't a man visit his two favorite girls?" he replied with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat, but Grace knew him too well now to be fooled. "What is it? Xavier?" His expression grew serious. "There have been reports of a mountain lion attacking livestock in the area. Johnson lost 3 calves last night." Grace instinctively pulled Emma closer. "How close?" "Too close for comfort. I want you both at the ranch until we track it down." His tone made it clear this wasn't a suggestion. Grace nodded, knowing better than to argue when Xavier's protective instincts were engaged. "I'll dismiss the children early and come home with you." The mountain lion proved elusive. For a week, Xavier and the other ranchers tracked it without success, finding only the occasional print or kill. Each night, he returned home exhausted and frustrated, concerned for the safety of his family and the community. Then came the morning when Grace awoke to find Xavier already gone. A note on his pillow explaining he'd received word of a sighting near the schoolhouse and had ridden out before dawn to investigate. Grace felt a prickle of unease as she fed and dressed Emma, but she reminded herself that Xavier was an experienced outdoorsman and an excellent shot. If anyone could handle the mountain lion, it was her husband. By mid-morning, with no word from Xavier, Grace's unease had grown to genuine worry. She was considering asking one of the ranch hands to ride to town for news when she heard a commotion outside. Looking through the window, she saw one of Xavier's men riding hard toward the house, leading Xavier's riderless black stallion. Grace's heart stopped. The news came in broken, breathless fragments. Xavier had tracked the mountain lion to a ravine near the schoolhouse. He dismounted to follow on foot. The big cat had been wounded by a previous hunter's bullet, making it even more dangerous. It had attacked without warning. "He got a shot off," the ranch hand explained, his face ashen. "Killed it clean, but not before." Grace didn't wait to hear more. Thrusting Emma into Martha Wilson's arms, the older woman having arrived to help with the baby that morning, she mounted the nearest saddled horse and rode toward town at a dangerous pace, her heart pounding with fear. She found him in the doctor's house, lying pale and still on a blood-soaked examination table. The doctor's grave expression told her everything before he even spoke. "The animal's claws severed an artery in his thigh," he explained gently. "He lost too much blood before they could get him to me. I'm sorry, Mrs. Caine. There's nothing I can do except make him comfortable." "He's still alive?" Grace asked, hope flaring briefly. The doctor nodded. "But fading fast. You should talk to him while you can." Xavier's eyes were closed when she approached, his breathing shallow. His skin had a grayish pallor that terrified her. Taking his hand, she was shocked by how cold it felt. "Xavier," she whispered, willing him to open his eyes. "I'm here, love." His eyelids fluttered, then opened. Those blue eyes, dimmed now with pain and approaching death, found her face. "Grace." His voice was barely audible. "Emma?" "She's safe," Grace assured him, tears streaming down her face. "She's with Martha." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Good." Then, with obvious effort, "I'm sorry." "Don't," Grace pleaded, pressing his hand to her cheek. "Don't apologize. Just stay with me. Fight, Xavier. Please fight." He squeezed her hand weakly. "Some fights can't be won." His breathing became more labored. "Tell Emma about me, the real me, not what people said." "You'll tell her yourself," Grace insisted, clinging desperately to his hand as if she could physically anchor him to life. "You'll watch her grow up. You'll teach her to ride and read the stars. You promised me, Xavier. You promised we'd grow old together." For a moment she saw a flash of the old fire in his eyes, the determination that had helped him survive the war, build a successful ranch, overcome the town's prejudice. Then it faded, replaced by a peace she'd rarely seen in him during life. "Loving you saved me," he whispered. "Best thing I ever did was marry you." His eyes held hers for one more moment, filled with all the love he'd once thought himself incapable of feeling. Then the light in them dimmed, and Xavier Caine, the harsh cowboy with the gentle heart, was gone. The town that had once laughed at Grace for marrying the damaged war veteran now wept openly at his funeral. The church overflowed with mourners, ranchers who had come to respect Xavier's skill and integrity, townspeople who had finally seen the true man behind the scars, children who had delighted in his rare but wonderful stories. Sheriff Miller spoke of Xavier's courage. The ranchers spoke of his fairness and work ethic. The children spoke of his kindness. But it was Martha Wilson who perhaps captured him best. "Xavier Caine came back from war a broken man," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "But he did not stay broken. Through Grace's love and his own determination, he became whole again. A loving husband, a gentle father, a valued neighbor, a true hero who gave his life protecting this community. We judged him harshly once. May God forgive us for that, as Xavier himself did." In the days that followed, as Grace moved through the fog of grief, the town rallied around her and Emma. Meals appeared on her doorstep. Ranch hands from neighboring properties offered their help with the cattle. The school board granted her a leave of absence with full pay. Grace found unexpected strength in her daughter and Emma's blue eyes that so reminded her of Xavier, in the tiny hands that reached for her, in the life they had created together that would carry Xavier's legacy forward. 3 months after Xavier's death, on what would have been their second wedding anniversary, Grace took Emma to the wildflower meadow above town, the place where Xavier had first kissed her, where he had proposed, where they had picnicked on countless Sunday afternoons. As the summer breeze rippled through the grass and wildflowers, Grace told her daughter stories about her father, not just the hero who had saved the town from outlaws and died protecting it from a predator, but the complicated, wounded, gentle man she had loved. The man who had read poetry by firelight, who had taught himself to braid Grace's hair because she mentioned once that she found it soothing, who had hummed old folk songs to Emma in the middle of the night when she wouldn't sleep. "Your father was the bravest man I ever knew," Grace told her daughter as they sat among the wildflowers. "Not just because he faced danger without flinching, but because he faced himself, his fears, his pain, his past, and refused to let them define him. That's the kind of courage I hope you'll have, Emma. The courage to be vulnerable, to love deeply, to be your truest self even when it's difficult." As the years passed, Grace continued to run the Broken Spur with the help of Xavier's loyal ranch hands. She eventually returned to teaching, bringing Xavier's love of learning and respect for nature into her classroom. Emma grew into a strong-willed girl with her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit. The town of Redemption Creek, once quick to judge, had learned a powerful lesson through Xavier Caine. They watched as his widow raised their daughter with stories of her father's courage and kindness. They saw how the harsh cowboy's legacy lived on in the prosperous ranch, in the community traditions he had helped establish, in the changed hearts of those who had once shunned him. And on quiet evenings, when Grace sat on the porch of the ranch house, watching the stars emerge, the stars Xavier had taught her to read, she felt his presence still in the beauty of the land he had loved, in the daughter who carried his spirit, and in her own heart, which had been brave enough to see beyond his scars to the good man beneath. In loving Xavier Caine, Grace had taught an entire town about redemption. In dying to protect what he loved, Xavier had shown them the true meaning of courage. Their love story, which had begun with mockery and ended in tragedy, had transformed not just two lives, but an entire community, proving that sometimes the harshest exteriors conceal the gentlest hearts, and that true love sees not what is, but what could be. On Emma's 18th birthday, Grace took her to the family plot on the hill behind the ranch house, where Xavier had been laid to rest. Emma, now a beautiful young woman with her father's eyes and quiet strength, knelt to place wildflowers on his grave. "I wish I could have known him," she said softly. Grace smiled through her tears. "You do know him, Emma. Every time I tell you his stories, every time you ride his land or read his books, every time you show the same courage and kindness he valued most." She took her daughter's hand. "And he knows you. I believe that with all my heart." As they walked back toward the house, the setting sun painted the mountains gold and crimson, just as it had on the evening Xavier had asked Grace to be his wife. The broken spur, no longer broken at all, spread out below them, a testament to one man's journey from darkness to light and to the woman who had helped him find his way. "The town laughed when I married your father," Grace told her daughter. "They called him harsh, damaged, unpredictable. They said I was throwing my life away. But they didn't see what I saw." Emma squeezed her mother's hand. "And then they wept when he died, saving you." They wept, Grace agreed, not just for the hero he became in their eyes at the end, but for the man they had misjudged for so long. "Your father's greatest legacy wasn't how he died, Emma. It was how he lived, how he fought his way back from his darkest places, how he loved us with everything he had, how he never stopped trying to be better tomorrow than he was today." As night fell over the ranch Xavier Caine had built, the stars emerged one by one, the same stars he had read, to find his way home, the stars he had taught Grace to love. And in their eternal light, his story continued, a harsh cowboy who had found redemption in love, a wounded warrior who had found peace, a misjudged man who had proven his worth not through vengeance, but through sacrifice. It was, Grace thought, as she and Emma walked arm in arm toward the house that had witnessed both their greatest joys and deepest sorrows, the most beautiful love story never written until now, in the hearts and memories of all who had been changed by knowing Xavier Caine, the harsh cowboy with the gentle heart.